Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. I'm very pleased this afternoon that we have Francois Viruly in the hot seat, and joining me is Quoin Online, who's going to help with this interview. And very happy to have Francois here. He's normally been in this hot seat interviewing everybody, but we thought it only right that we interview somebody who's had such an incredible impact on the property industry, particularly from the education perspective. And so thank you, Francois, for joining us this afternoon. I think you are well known to the industry, but I'd like to perhaps give you the opportunity to introduce yourself a bit and to explain how you got into this rather crazy profession.
Well, Rob, I was actually at the Chamber of Mines. I was in the mining industry, and a colleague of mine actually went off to start the research department at JHI Properties. And he was there for about 2 or 3 months, and he gave me a call and said, "This is not for me. Would you want to do this?" So I thought about this, and I went for the interview. I remember very clearly Les Wheel interviewing me and saying, "So Francois, what do you know about property?" And I explained that I had just sold my house at an enormous loss. And that sort of qualified me to start in the property sector. Maybe more on my economics background than on my property background. And so I got in JH. I remember the very first day I opened up the URERU report and a cap rate. I had no idea. I still don't know after 20 years what a cap rate is, but so be it. And so I was for quite a number of years at JHI. And then started, while I was at JHI, I was invited at Wits University to come and give some evening lectures. So that got me into the lecturing space. And then I started, about 20 years ago, I started Viruly Consulting. I was just of the view that there was a place for an advisory service that wouldn't necessarily be in the direct transaction. And that's where I found myself in the property market ever since as a researcher. And then 10 years ago, moved from Wits to UCT. So you're quite right, Rob. I've always had this balance with research on the one hand and being in the teaching environment, and that's how I keep myself busy.
It's but interesting that you say that, because when I was preparing for this interview, I was thinking that there were sort of 3 main areas that you've been involved in. The research has obviously been key. Education has been very important. And then obviously you've run a very successful consulting practice as well. So there's 3 arrows in your quiver. Perhaps we can focus on those as we go through, and perhaps you start with education. I mean, if you said you started as doing part-time guest lecturing at Wits.
It's interesting. I mean, and I think with property courses around South Africa, most of them are not that old, actually. And to this very day, when a student says, "I'm doing property studies," what are you doing? Are you an architect, an engineer? But I think what we've seen is out of the QSing environment, largely these courses starting, and to bring some academic rigor to the discipline. And I think the other important issue is that I think fairly early on we saw the importance of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyor, the RICS, and to try to bring the profession to that sort of level. So I think that's where a lot of work happened. And then we saw the programs at Wits, UCT, University of Pretoria. Stellenbosch has also had it to some degree. But I think what has also interested me, Rob, is that what we're lacking still to this very day, and that is if you don't get into a university, and many people don't, how do you get a decent level of education? And I think that has interested me as well. And I suppose the SAPOA PDP course that I've been involved with has happened there. But I still think that there's much to be done for a number of people just to get into the sector.
You work on or you're involved in education on a lot of different platforms. I mean, you're involved in a very sort of pure academic platform. Yeah. You're involved in a sort of CPD master classes type of thing. And then you're more sort of interestingly, I suppose, in more recent years, you've been involved in some quite innovative teaching using WhatsApp as your platforms, et cetera, and dealing with people who wouldn't ordinarily be in a classroom. Do you want to just describe some of the differences between some of those platforms?
One of the most exciting courses I'm involved with at the moment is with TUF, the Trust for Urban Housing Finance. And these are property entrepreneurs. These are not people who are going to come to a course. They're not even going to open up a laptop because they're on the go. These are people doing deals in the property market. So they really came to me and said, how can we do something? So it's not completely on WhatsApp, but I think what I was trying to do is, can we teach property with one-liners? And I think we can. Hi, everybody. Today the interest rates have shifted. What do you think it means for the property market? Well, and then everybody responds and everybody thought a bit. And these are very rich courses and I'm starting to think that you can teach with one-liners. Many of our students only read one line. But anyway, and I think that's important. So what we're also seeing, which I've been involved with, is the Get Smarter program, which is a totally online program. And what amazes me actually is in the recent COVID environment, the numbers registered on this course hasn't dropped at all. We've remained at exactly the same number. So it just shows that what will happen, I think just to finish on the point, is that education will never look the same. I think that if there's one thing that will change out of the COVID-19 environment, is education. I think a lot will happen online, whether it's at the university levels, down, and as you said, down the different tiers of property education.
I suppose education in that space of crossing the divide between entrepreneurs and education, because often the more formal education, those graduates end up as asset managers in corporates as opposed to entrepreneurs. And crossing that divide is probably the space to be looking into.
Now, and that's a real interesting point, because on the one hand, you can say, can you teach entrepreneurship? Well, some people argue you either have it or you don't. Or you have everybody thinking that they can become a Branson. Well, sometimes you've got to look at yourself and say, well, maybe I'm not. That's not my character trait. But I think that still that what I've picked up is that there are concepts, understanding a basic yield, a return. So I think there are important concepts. And I think where the theory becomes interesting, and in fact, Rob, I remember us having a discussion about this fairly recently, is that the theoretical frameworks puts it all together. It's a bit like, I don't know, saying to a mechanic, change the exhaust pipe. Hopefully you understand the role of that exhaust pipe in the engine, and that it's not just the exhaust pipe. So I think it's those interrelationships that become important.
Yeah. And I suppose if one gives that level of formalizing, it also allows those entrepreneurs to be able to deal with the formal sector, like the banks and others, because the problem is when you apply to the bank, it's quite a rigorous formal process that you almost need to go through. And
you've got to speak the same language. So you've got to give them the language to engage with the rest of the industry.
And I think that's important. But those courses are superb. I will never forget Josephine. Josephine comes to my course. I said, hey, Josephine, welcome to the course. And she said to me, Prof, I won't understand a thing that you're going to say to me over the next few weeks. But my daughter, I've also got her onto the course. She's going to understand, and in the evening she'll explain it to me. Now, Josephine was an elderly lady. So I said, how did you get into property? She said, you know what? She was a domestic employee in the center of Johannesburg. The person she was working for decided to leave the CBD and said, Josephine, I'm leaving. You know what? You can have my flat. So that was her first flat. The next person who left, she gave 5,000 rands to. Josephine, sitting on the course, has got 60 flats. 60. Now, this is somebody who's got into the property market, got actually very far to owning 60. And when I said yield to her, she said, I just want my money. And I said, well, Josephine, there are some concepts here. No, but I think what is happening is that there are a lot of individuals entering the property market. And let's be frank, for many people in this country, property was not something that was discussed around the dinner table. If you owned a property, for many it was in Bantustans. But so I think that we're seeing the first generation coming through in much of South Africa where property is on the radar screen. And I think that, yes, if you're around the dinner table, you will learn the concepts, or you will. But this is the first generation.
But I suppose also the thing about property is that you can do it at a small scale.
Yeah.
Those micro developers that are doing it are applying the same principles as the guy who's doing the billion rand development.
I always say there's something for everyone in the property market. When the big institutional investor doesn't want the property anymore, that property is probably good enough for someone else. There's something for everyone in here. And they all play a different role. They all have different expectations.
But I mean, that reminds me of an article that actually Francois gave me a number of years ago. He came into my office and said, Rob, you must read this. And it was the notional developer. And we have this idea that developers live in particular places, do particular types of developments, drive particular cars, etc. And you're right, it's somebody adds a room onto the back of their house, they're a developer. And so if you want to understand this industry, you actually need to understand the full spectrum.
And I think that's the great thing, that there is something for everyone. And that notional developer, there's a sense that the developer on a Friday night is reading an integrated development plan and getting excited about it. Anyway.
But isn't that part of it is that also, and that's, I suppose, where some of that teaching comes as well, is for the small developer to be able to actually just navigate his way through things like STPs and all of these, because development is actually quite simple until you end up going to the city council, and at which point it gets terribly complicated.
But when the critical point that you make is that to some degree the system is stacked against the small player. If you're doing a big development and the rezoning takes another 6 months, you can do it, But if you're a small developer, 6 months can be the difference between the collapse of the deal, or you can't hold it that long. So I think that whilst we often talk of small businesses, I think that a number of the municipalities, through the systems they have, are actually working against the smaller player. And it also means that if you're going to go through a process, you might as well do 1,000 houses on a green field, because it will take you as long as doing 20 units in the inner city. So actually, I think it pushes the development in the wrong direction as well.
Yeah.
And development costs that just almost become exorbitant around requirements that the city needs,
Well, it's the cost of the process, not the cost of the development.
Well, it's the transaction costs. Yeah,
absolutely. Before we move on, just from the education theme to finish off, I mean, I know from many students and alumni from the university, they've always enjoyed your classes, etc., and you've left quite an imprint on many people. What do you see as your role as being an educator? What role do you see yourself playing in that space?
It depends at what level you are involved with. I think by the time you get to a master's level, you are a facilitator of knowledge, because there is a lot of knowledge in your students. They're not empty vessels. Even the first year, they're not empty vessels, but there is already a fair amount of real estate. And in certain instances, a lot more practical knowledge than what I can bring to the party. So I think the role there is to unleash what exists in the classroom. By the time you get to the first years, you're in a different scenario. No, again, these are not empty vessels. These are people who come from different places. But there, I think the role that you have is, of course, to bring the concepts to the fore. And I must say, maybe the master's students listening to this, you won't like it, but I use the same notes for my master's students as my first year students. But the level of the discussion is very, very different. And I think that's what differentiates a master's program from an undergraduate and first year. But you know, the first years are fine. You know, you walk in on a Monday and you share the novel that you've read over the weekend as well, and I make them come up with what rap songs are about cities, and I stop with New York, Frank Sinatra, but you know, I believe there's 50 Cents. I've also got that there are some pretty good rap songs. So, but it's also, I think at first year level, it's something that we're missing at the moment with the online programs, is for people to meet each other. I always say a lecture, it's a bit like an orchestra. When an orchestra plays, the quality of what happens is because there's an audience there. There is a togetherness. We are doing this together. And I think that that's the important thing in education, that you got to have this. We are a community of learners. Some of us have been there longer. Someone said the other day, what do you do? I said, I've never left university. I'm still a student. And I'm still a student. I'm learning every single day. I just have the privilege of having been a student for 40 years. But I think it is that. And it is that learning environment. And I think that's what I think is important.
You know, have you seen over the years a change transformatively in the property industry? And I'm not only talking racially, but gender as well. Because you know, I go to a lot of the listeds and they don't look very changed.
No, I think there's still a lot to be done in this particular sector. It depends on what part of the industry you're looking at. I think in the valuers, I think for profession, I think that was one of the worst, but I think there we're starting to see a movement. And yes, look, I think there's much being done at the moment, but
the student profile is changing, though.
The student profile is changing. I mean, if I even look at my students in front of me, half of them must be, for example, non-white students. But I think we still have a role to play in making it a sector that is attractive for people to want to come and join. You know, that they see that. And I think we haven't still to this very day professionalized the sector sufficiently. But yeah, to answer your question, there's much to be done.
I think, Francois, how you described your role, if I can reinforce that or back it up, I remember sitting once in a staff room meeting where it was being decided who would lecture what classes. And you were lecturing on the master's program, and then it went around, the HOD went around and said, anybody like to take the first years? And everybody put their heads down and hid behind anything that they could, because nobody wanted to lecture first years. And you said, I'll lecture the first years. And I was like, Francois, do you really want to go down this road? Because nobody likes lecturing to the first years. And he said, Rob, I don't have to teach them any content. I just got to enthuse them about the topic. Yeah. And that's why I think you actually do well with the way that you're doing, because you said they can learn it over time. The technical stuff, it'll be either in subsequent lectures or off YouTube or wherever they'll learn it, but you've got to get the person enthused, and I think you were on the button there.
And I think that I remain with that point. Actually, we should put our most senior members of staff
in the first
year. There is that sense of with time, I'm only lecturing master's students. I think that's wrong. I think that actually you can put your new lecturers in third years, second year. But if you don't get it right in that first year, yeah, I think that's where you need your most senior people. And you know what? Over the years, I've looked at what makes a good lecture. You've got the entertainer. So you've had 45 minutes. It's been great. We've all enjoyed it. You haven't learned... okay. Then you have also the driest person around reading from, and you know how enthusiastic I'm about PowerPoint presentations, which are rarely powerful and rarely to the point. And then you have the third, and I think the students remember people with enthusiasm. Yeah. You can even be the driest person around, but I think an audience picks up very quickly whether you actually care about the topic and about them. And I think it's not only a lecturing thing. I think anybody who gives a presentation, I think you have about 30 seconds to make that happen or not.
Yeah.
But enthusing is, I suppose, a big aspect. You know, I probably have employed the most graduates out of UCT. And, you know, when we were at the PIC, you just let them loose, you know, and you said, go and do your thing. And surprisingly, very seldom did they not shape up.
Right.
Yeah.
Wait, you know the point I often make, and I often say to the students, when you leave here, there'll be people from other institutions who will be able to do the job much better than you do. But hopefully, having come from a university, you will say, why are we doing it this way? Is there another way of doing it? You may not be the best George, maybe somebody will do a calculation faster than you, and very quickly, but hopefully, what we have done, and I think education at any level must be about developing people who ask the questions. And I think that's, and I often said that with, you know, I mean, a few years ago I wasn't very popular when I sat in an exam where I said, raise your own question and answer it. And I'm going to mark the quality of the question. No, I want to see a real good question here. And you can answer it yourself. But that's not the point.
And that may be the way you guys have to go with online learning nowadays, because so many copies. I suppose you pose a question and answer it yourself.
I was at a meeting recently where someone said, no, you know, the one thing we can't sort out yet is the technology around the exam. That's still the big bugbear. So I said, how about the idea that we don't have exams anymore? But it may well be that we get to a point, continuous assessment, and you say to people, ask the questions. Or ask me a great question. And if it's a great question, you'll get 100%.
Or give them the answer paper and ask them what the questions were.
Turn it around.
Here's the thing. But what you could do is give somebody and say, here's a text, ask some questions about this. I think that's the power of the question rather than the answer.
But I think you guys, I mean, you've, without realizing it over the last 15, 20 years, you've probably shaped the landscape of the property industry as much as developers and funds have, with the quality of the students you've put in. I think if you look around at graduates out of property studies, you find them in all aspects. No?
You would hope so, and I always hope that most of them stay with the sector, and that but I think most of our students do find a place. But the issue is that with RICS and a few other things, they're just as good in London and everywhere else. So, but I think that's going to be the challenge that we will have to deal with.
Just last off on the education side, and we don't have a double period here, so we do need to move on. But I remember you explaining to me once that the attributes that a student actually from the continent, from sub-Saharan Africa in property, had to have the same attributes as some of the students that were, for instance, doing their property studies in Europe, but they had to go beyond that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I think it's completely true. Our students need to know their IRRs, NPVs, and they need to do their cash flows as good as a student coming out of Reading University or CAS or somewhere. But I think we've got a further issue to deal with, and that's a developmental issue. We've got a specific context, a social context, a difficult social context. And I think that any graduate who moves out or moves into the sector must be able to have some appreciation, of that. Look, yes, they'll have to do their IRR, but what I always say, when you do a development, what makes the development possible is not that the IRR is at the right number, but whether society is going to accept your development, whether you're going to get the zoning, whether it is actually doable. So what I'm saying is that you can have an IRR of 40% on a project that's not doable. The IRR is not sufficient. You've got to have, to start with, your own expertise. Have you done a retail development before? Have you done this? And B, will society allow you to actually do this? And I think that if something is going to change in education around real estate, it's going to be on the ESG issue, the environmental, social, and governance. In fact, this morning I was just looking that investors are increasingly going to put into the remuneration policy of REITs ESG benchmarks. Saying we will want to see whether directors in our REITs meet environmental levels, governance level, and social and ethics. These are becoming completely central, just as much as some of the financial indicators that are being used in remuneration policies.
In the same way, I suppose that tenants who are going to be renewing in the next few months, next few years, are going to ask themselves a question how their landlord treated them during COVID, as to whether they're going to renew or not.
You know what, and I often have said that the one thing is people remember how you treated them during the lockdown. And look, it's going to be complex. As somebody said to me rightly, that those who came up first to say, I'm not paying the lease, were companies that were going under in any case. They used the first opportunity that came their way to use this as an opportunity to get out of the lease and get out of the whole thing and close the business down. Others who kept on going were the ones who were quite serious. But look, so yes, I think just to answer, I think more and more a lot of real estate students would do well by doing some courses in sociology, I would argue in psychology as well. And I think those worlds, you can't keep it apart to the degree that you could have 10, 15 years ago. So yes, that's happening in London as well, but I think it's the challenges, and I've often said, it's still a paper I want to write, making a property decision with no data. And it's not completely flippant in the sense that if you go to certain parts across this continent, there is no data or very little. So either you're going to walk in with your spreadsheet day one and say, I can't do an IRR, hence there is no deal, when actually deals are happening every day.
Right.
And why are they not happening? And yes, without data, it becomes more complex. It depends on the relationships you have with people, who you believe, who you don't believe. And I think those are tools that which are different in the environment that we deal with.
So speaking about projects, and then perhaps moving on to more your consulting work over the years. You've done a lot of consulting within South Africa itself, but you've also done a lot of consulting north of our borders. Some interesting projects that you've worked on over the years?
I've got a lot of projects that never materialized. And I've done, you see, and that's the problem as a researcher, because I remember somebody who said to me some time ago, Francois, I would like you to do the research on this project. Will you do it at risk? So I said, if the project doesn't happen, I don't get paid, right? He said, yeah. Well, I said, research doesn't work that way, Otherwise, I will tell you immediately that you should go ahead and do it. So I've been involved. I've taken out of principle, I'll be a researcher, with the result that many of my projects have never happened because I've told them that maybe it couldn't happen. But I think that, look, we all know that there are, across the continent, some big projects where just the demand just hasn't been there. And there've been papers written about it, these fantastical cities across Africa, where at the end it starts as mixed use. All the uses are there, hotel, retail, office, you got it all in there. And it's called either the Dubai of Africa, or the Manhattan of Africa, or the Singapore of Africa. Now, and designed by somebody in Singapore, and you look at this and you say it's not going to happen, and then of course people look at you and say, oh well, you've got to be more optimistic, and in the long run it will work well. And then I'm going to quote the economist that has driven me over the years, John Maynard Keynes, who said, and as you know, no interview with me happens without a reference to John Maynard Keynes. In the long term, we're all dead. Yes, your development will be a success at some point, somewhere in the future. But ultimately, many of these big mixed-use developments, go and look at them later, it's affordable housing. That's where the demand is. And I think, and it's, Rob, I think we've worked on a number of things where if the demand is not there, it's not going to happen. Look, I'm the first one to accept that in certain cases, would there have been a demand for a Melrose Arch when you stood there on the first day, or a Century City? Often in Africa, you do look at a field in front of you, an empty field, and with a bit of imagination, you can think of something. And in certain cases, these African cities do actually grow very fast. Come back 5-10 years later, actually there's a lot that has happened. But what hasn't happened is the new urbanism being drawn over and over again. And then finally, on this topic is there's a whole industry that makes money on whether a development happens or not. Consulting fees and professionals, and there are a lot of people. So there's a whole industry that is ultimately, yes, if it happens, of course it's good, and you hope that you will be a consultant for the years to come out of that. So yes, I've worked on numerous projects, from industrial development zones to hotels to developments over the years. And yeah, you know what, over the years, the one thing you learn very quickly is, especially on bigger developments, phasing is everything. Even if you have that big picture, but phase one must be a success. A bit like what happened at the V&A waterfront.
Yeah.
You can't say, well, by the time we get to phase 5, you will have your marina. Well, no. We've seen developments that have failed on that. So I think the phasing and getting that right becomes critical.
But I suppose also the ability to be strong enough to say, no, this thing is not going to work. Yeah. Because often you look at these fantastical things and every consultant gives you the answer he thinks you want.
But it's tough not to give the answer, you know. you sit there, I don't want to influence you, but you've got to stand by it. And I suppose you may be successful, but not over the next 10 years. But it's a balance, you know. And you know, I've been quite involved with behavioral finance and behavioral economics and decision making. I suppose it's that issue of Daniel Kahneman, who got a PhD around this work, this level 1 and level 2 thinking. Level 1 is your gut feel. And I think let's not underestimate somebody who's been 30, 40 years in an industry. You've built up a gut feel saying, I think this can happen. Yes, it can. And it's not flippant. It's serious. You've seen many deals over the years. You've seen things. But then you also need that level 2 thinking, which says, let's get some numbers here. Otherwise, you run the risk that your biases take you off into the stratosphere. So I think there's a value in having both, in having people around who believe that it can work, who've had some work, and still have those numbers at the back that say, watch out, or yes, you're right.
And some of these projects, some of them weren't always just for consulting, but you've done some quite interesting research projects as well. And I remember speaking to you once and asking you to attend a meeting or something, and you said, no, you wouldn't be in town. You were heading to Zimbabwe. And it was exactly at the time when Zimbabwe basically was everyone thought it was going up in flames and everyone was getting out of Zimbabwe as far as possible, and you were getting a ticket into Zimbabwe. And I said to you, what are you going to Zimbabwe for? And you gave quite an interesting response.
Well, what I wrote, I can't remember the response immediately, but I remember writing a paper out of it called A Litre per Square Meter. And I called it a litre per square meter because a litre petrol coupon gave you a square meter, was equivalent to the rental. So since the currency had fallen apart, people were paying each other with notes and sweets, and you would bring the printer in at the end of the month to pay for the lease. And what challenged me there was how a property market works when you have 20,000% inflation rate or something of that sort. I mean, escalation, 20,000.
But your point was that it did continue.
And this,
The market still continued. Transactions continue to take place in that environment.
Did you know it's still interesting at the end of the day, where even when the formal institutional arrangements have weakened, the transactions carry on. Did transactions carry on during the Second World War? And how? And so there is, yes, your transaction costs become more careful. Do you have title at the end of the day? Don't you have title? And the nice thing, which I always say, when the market works well, I don't need to know you from a bar, so you buy my property and I don't care who you are, because I've got a process in place that guarantees the transaction. The moment I don't have that, I'm limited to only dealing with my friends and people that I know, because I can't be sure. And I think that is the big difference between a market that works well versus a market that doesn't, and it limits. So yes, these transactions will still happen, but in a much more difficult way, of course. And I think so. I think that has been interesting. I've also had interest in how property markets start in post-conflict, in the post-conflict environment, whether it's in, as we've seen in southern Sudan, in Juba, and in other places. And I've been interested to say, if after, like in Angola, after 40 years of, and Mozambique at the time, of civil war, if we got 4 people around the table and we said, let's get this property market going again, what would be the first thing that we would do? What is the sequencing that we would follow to get a property market to function?
Right.
And that comes back to the rules of the game and how they work. And I think that has been something that has interested me. And of course, and I don't want to go into the war scenario, but in the war scenario, you often have the problem that those who win the war feel that they own the properties as well. And people who come back after the war and knock on their front door and say, I'm back at home, somebody else has moved in. Anyway, that's...
Well, I suppose in a post-apartheid South Africa, that concept around how township properties can hopefully get greater value and be able to be leveraged against and go from being a house and to going from a house you live in into an asset. Yeah.
From the 1913 Land Act, somebody took 80% of the country. Huh? And now you may not say it's war, but it was an institutional arrangement. And I mean, even in Cape Town still, I mean, the people living all sorts of the place. When District 6 was reduced to what it is now, people found themselves all over the place. And now you're almost knocking on that door of District 6 and saying, I'm back.
Talk about stimulating markets. I mean, Francois, I know one of your frustrations with economics has been that somewhere along the line, land got lost in the conversation. So we're talking about stimulating economies, et cetera, and everything else going on, et cetera. And yet, if you look at sort of mainstream economics, you don't. The ideas of property and land and that are just not at the forefront.
Land had a role in economics, which we taught with Adam Smith, David Ricardo. You move upwards to just about neoclassical economics, with Jevons and Marshall and at Cambridge and John Maynard Keynes a bit later. land disappeared. And what happened is that land got considered in the same way as a piece of machinery. Marginal utility theory came up, and marginal cost, marginal revenue, you played yourself out on there. But I think we fundamentally lost the fact that land, if I were to give you a photo of a piece of machine and a piece of land, you would respond differently, at least I hope, to seeing land than a piece of machinery. Land is something different. And I think we lost that. And land disappeared out of economics largely. The only thing that we're seeing is that it's finding its way back at the moment through the ecological environmental movement, where suddenly land and the meaning of land and the climate discussions we're having at the moment, I think that's changing our tune in the way that we see land. So what has happened to land in economics has concerned me. And the other thing in economics that has concerned me is that we've lost in economics a bit economics has functioned at too high a level. In other words, you got an economy, how do you get the economy? You ask an economist, how do you get the economy? And he'll say, you increase aggregate demand. And then your next question, and how are you going to do that? And then for some reason the economist hasn't got much to say after that. No, but it's and then you end up in industrial policy or local economic development. But I think we've lost this ability. Again, John Maynard Keynes, at least John Maynard Keynes said that aggregate demand had a role to play. Whilst all the other economists said, just let it go. It's a bit like a patient where the person is dying there and the free marketeer will say, no, don't give him any medicine or her any medicine. This person will be fine. Well, yeah, sometimes it's good to give the penicillin and to come. Or we've seen it in COVID. Yeah, well, maybe we'll give them something down, we'll assist down the line with some policies. You'll be assisting a company that's gone bust, right? They won't be there to be assisted. It's a bit like saying to a patient, we'll look after you after you're dead. You've got to help the person or the company now. If they don't get some assistance in the next 2 months, to say we'll come and help you in 2 years' time once we've renegotiated,
Which I suppose takes me to a question which I can ask you now, and then I can decide when I'm going to flight this answer. With COVID, there's almost a view, if you speak to most of the property funds, that the office market is dead, and nobody will ever return to the office, and demand is going to drop, and the likes. And sort of, where do you see us in 2 years from now? Because so much of the
this question, and
much of the REIT industry has been built off the back of office space.
Absolutely. Look, I think there are a few things at play here. And let me first take retail. We've gone from the market to the department store, and from the department store, we moved to the shopping center. It all had to do with transport at the end of the day. The marketplace, you moved from Yadukaus to the city. And then when we look at the department store to the shopping center, it was about movement, it was about the car. Getting enough people to drive to one spot. I think that e-retailing, the internet, will do to the shopping centers what the car did to the department store. I think it'd be naive to say that the world stops with the shopping center. As naive as it would have been to say that the department store was the end. It wasn't. So I think we've got to accept that we're moving forward. And as transport, it's not going to be the car, but it's still transport, but it's going to be e-retailing, the way we interact, the way we buy things. The question around the offices, I think that the office market is in trouble. I think that what was interesting with COVID is that, you have this path dependency. You're going down a road. How suddenly it broke that path dependency. Things that would have not been possible a year ago suddenly we saw it was possible. Imagine having walked in a year ago into a boardroom and said, we're going to send everybody home. Well, so you're crazy. When actually it wasn't. It just the rules of the game make us believe what is possible and not possible. And I think what COVID has shown us is the possibility of something different. So I think the office market is in trouble. But real estate never stops. Those properties are going to be used for something else. Very rarely do you have properties left for the rest. And I think it'll probably, I've taken largely a view the next few years is about the residential property market. I think, especially in South Africa, we're sitting with 2.5 million square meters of office space floating in this market at the moment. I think we need a fair amount of economic growth before we start taking that up. And the other thing that's going to happen is that the P grade is going to fill up. So we're going to shift the rentals, so that C grade will fall off, and everybody starts moving.
But I mean, doesn't that also create an opportunity to create cities that have people that live in them? Because South African cities, by and large, have been...
And that is, I think, a critical point, where, especially in South Africa, mixed use was for higher income people. We've never been able to bring mixed use down to lower incomes. And I think that naturally the best place to do that is our CBDs. They are already mixed use. They already offer home, work, play. So either we're going to reinvent new ones, or we're actually going to make, I think, the opportunity, exactly your point, trying to find that mix. So I think there'll be a more interesting...
Because a bad C-grade office location is a good residential location.
And that's not only a South African story. It's a global story. I mean, the residential housing, the housing story is a global problem.
But in South Africa, it could possibly break apartheid spatial planning. That, our cities have been designed in a particular way, and it's almost impossible to break it. But
I think
with stuff becoming available in CBDs, you could.
What it does is it creates those rungs in the housing ladder. I think we're missing a number of those rungs. And I think that we have people who are stuck in a particular sector who can't move out of that because the next ones are either too expensive or so. So what you actually want in a property market is a flow from RDP going up the whole way.
But have you seen any other changes over your lifespan of looking at the property market? If you look at the last 30 years, how does it change? And we've spoken a little bit how you see the future being.
I think that the biggest one I've, of course, seen in South Africa over the years has been, of course, the decentralization. I mean, and I think that the whole decentralization movement, where also a lot of companies we will never leave the CBD, and ultimately did. And then the other critical change has been in the early years of my career, the big players, when you were at a cocktail party, you were largely next to the pension funds. The pension funds were the owners of the properties, they were the ones. And then, of course, we saw the whole REIT sector. So I think what we've seen over the last decades is this growth of the REIT sector, where funding to the commercial sector was minimal. That trajectory will carry on. I think we will get to a point where the farmer in Limpopo who's got 5 rands will take up a cell phone and say, I'm buying some real estate, or I'm buying 1/1,000,000th of the Sandton shopping centre,
and that's being facilitated through technology, and the growth of technology is facilitating that.
And that's where prop tech will play its role, where I think we will tokenize the real estate to such a level that one of the characteristics of property was that it's chunky, big amounts and so forth. And I think we'll bring it down. Of course, when people often say, I can't get into property. Well, I can give you a number of REITs where you can buy for 70 cents. 50 cents. You can be an owner of a part owner. Why are people asking that question? There is still something that is too complicated.
Right.
I still need to walk to the bank and speak to somebody and say, "Hey, I want a stop order on this, and I need to buy into the units." And I think that's one thing we'll see over the next decades. We'll see this really with your cell phone. What I sometimes say to my students is that, instead of buying a beer for 30 rands, you can buy quite a good stock. They normally see more value in the beer, which we can have a long debate about. But people can get into the commercial.
But as technology gets easier, as prop tech gets into that space,
I think more that will happen.
It becomes more accessible.
Yeah. You've mentioned John Maynard Keynes, I think 3 to 4 times so far, which is pretty good going. Is he your hero in the industry, or are there particular people in the industry that have impressed you, influenced you?
Interesting question. Look, from an economics, I'll be upfront, I'm a Keynesian in economics. I believe that in a I suppose you can call me a socio-democrat. I do believe in the role of the state. I think that the state has a critical role to play, certainly in the vulnerable parts of our society. We can't just leave people and say, you're on your own. It doesn't help people, and we don't give them the tools, at least, to improve whatever they want to achieve in life. I'm also a Keynesian that said when things go bad, as somebody said, the economy is too important to leave it to economists. No, but I think the point being made there is that the economy is a social construct. It's not about GDP numbers, whether it's 3, 4. It's about employment. We have economies to make society better off. And I think, we've got to manage our economy as society to achieve that. It can't just be about, we're successful. Because yes, 6% GDP of course helps. Let's not be, but I think there's more to it. Mark Weiner was one of them, the late Mark Weiner. He was a real property person. And he always used to say, you got to kick the bricks. I'll always remember that quote. And his other quote is that every building has a personality. And I think it's true. There's some buildings that are just nice. They have a personality. And whether that's the reflection of good architecture, you can debate about. So, and I think that, yes, if there's somebody who understood the market, and the one thing Mark Weiner would always say, at the end of the day, it's about the tenant. And Rob, I know we've had discussions. It's about the user at the end of the day. You have long discussions. Where's the developer? Where's the investor? Yeah, sure, we want them. But ultimately, why would somebody want to be at spot A or B? And I think that must remain the critical issue in the property market.
Lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, look, I think that at the end of the day, look, I've often been in a position, certainly for the last years, looking at the property market. If you ask me, are you a big developer investor? Probably not. But I think there is an issue around integrity. I think those who, and who was it? Somebody in the property market, I can't remember who said, I only do business with serious people. Now, with serious does not mean that you can't have a laugh, but these are people who really are taking the game seriously. Also, the developers who understand cities, who understand society, who understand, I think those have been the successful ones, who really also see real estate as an integral part of society and not only a number on a cash flow. I think that's...
Yeah, and where Francois started as a miner and by default got into property, where do you see yourself? What's the next one? A sailor?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that's movable property almost. No, look, I think in the next few years, I certainly, I want to say in education. And you know what, it's something, as they always say, education is something you give, but you've still got it.
Once you've taught, you're giving the whole time, but you've still got it. You've still, if anything else, you learn out of it. I'm involved with a REIT, and I get a lot of pleasure of understanding really into the mechanics of the property market, and I also certainly want to play an important role there. And then I hope to be doing a bit more across the continent. I love this continent. I think there's much to be done in the continent, but it's not that I want to do things, but I just want to go and understand it, you know.
Well, you're going to have your work cut out for you when you're the president of the International Real Estate Society in 2022. So congratulations on that. Well done. But to close out, if you were to speak to a young person entering the industry or the profession now, any words of advice that you would give them?
The first thing I would say is that when you leave university, go for the experience and not the pay. I've seen too many who says the one who pays you the most. The problem is when somebody pays a lot, they expect a lot. So generally, it's tend to take it easy, and I'm serious with that. Take the first 2 years and finish, for example, your RICS, your professional qualification. So my advice is go for the experience when you're new, and the pay may or may not follow after that. But I've seen too many mistakes being made of people who go for the paycheck immediately.
Well, Francois, thank you for your input into the industry. You've left a huge impact on a lot of people in this space, and I think the profession and the industry owes a lot of gratitude to you. And thank you very much for your time this afternoon that you've given for this interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I've learned something out of that. It made me think about a few things. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.